All right, so we're going to talk about the React Context API. So again, we've completed new site 6 in terms of functionality, but we just want to talk about, again, ways that we can make our code better. Again, React Context is just a way to allow us to, I guess, manage data within our application in a slightly different way than we do it with just passing props around everywhere. So we'll kind of focus on that. Before we do start talking about Context API, just definitely want to make sure we're good with new site 6. So again, anything that we did today or any other just general questions about new site, kind of want to pause and make sure we handle any questions that you guys might have. So there was a lot to, again, just going through this README, looking up documentation. Again, I don't always remember like the fetch API, so I did look that up for the post method, seeing what headers and other values I need to pass. But okay, hopefully you guys are able to get through this.
I've got a question.
Yeah, yes.
So how would this work as far as like the tokens and stuff in real life? Like right here, we've got this like separate API thing that's running. How would you normally do that?
Great question. So if you actually go back to our curriculum page, we have some external links. The token-based authentication link kind of just points you towards that. I guess I already had that open. This is actually a good write-up. It kind of tells you various ways that authentication is achieved. So yeah, I would say definitely give this a read. It's not too long of a page. They have some nice visuals. So yeah, give this a read. I think this will answer some questions there. But if you want to kind of just scan it, there's token types. So there's, I guess, different ways you can implement tokens. Connected would be like physical items. So like I know for my previous job, we had VPN access, but we also had like an actual physical token. I guess eventually it was like a phone app, but it's still something physical where it would generate a token for us based, like, I don't know how long each token will last, but there's definitely an expiration date or expiration time. So you had to use a token, I think every 60 seconds actually. This fob that we had would update a token, and we would have to enter that when we're trying to log in to the VPN. So that's an example of like a physical authorization. Again, eventually we had like a app, which is, I guess, a little less physical, but there's also contactless. So magic ring would be an example. So again, there's various ways that authorization can be achieved.
Yeah, I was gonna ask because we kind of hard coded the emails for like access like inside of our news site. How would that work like in real life? Is it just in this documentation or?
Yeah, so we've hard coded those logins. In real life, we'd have a backend server. So again, we're going to get to this, I guess, later this week or early next week, where we're going to actually implement the backend and the front end. In this case, the backend, which is the server that's running, that's already been created. It's like kind of like a dummy server that does what we want it to do. But yeah, we're going to actually create the backend on Django, and we're actually going to go through a process of authenticating users and passing that tokens. So there's still more on this topic. I know we just did a very high-level overview, just going through this diagram, but we're going to dive more into it, I think, early next week, talking about how we actually go about authenticating and creating tokens. So again, definitely give this page a read. It's not too much, not too much. I don't think it overwhelms you. It's a good introductory explanation of authorization. It gives you some history of it also. So a good read there. And then there's also a link to JSON web tokens. This read is definitely more technical, so it's not kind of easy to digest, but we're going to be using JSON web tokens next week. So there's more to come on this topic. So yeah, we're definitely going to understand how to create tokens and use that within our application. So good question there. We'll get more detail, I guess, going forward.
Can I throw something in real quick?
Go for it.
So authentication and authorization are two separate things. We've already done authentication by creating creating users and passwords. That's the authentication part. And then as a successful response to an authentication, a authorization token gets generated and passed back to you as the user or to your user. And then that is what they use to communicate with each of the devices to say, yes, I have authenticated.
Yep, I guess good distinction there. So there's authentication versus authorization. Similar sounding words, but yeah, there's a distinction there. All right, yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jeremy. All right, so any other questions on new site 6, what we've done up until this point? Hopefully you guys, again, have a functioning website, can kind of understand how React made this possible, just having components, easy to reuse code, having those components, and having them interact with one another. Okay, so let's talk about the context API. All right, so what is context React? This, to summarize it, allows you to pass data to components without having to pass props around. So our normal way of communicating between props is communicating between components is passing on props from parent components down to child components. And then I guess child components can communicate with parent components via like a callback. So that's our usual way. That's what we've learned. That totally works. As we saw, our new site 6, we've implemented it. Yeah, everything works as expected. But context is just another way to achieve what we're doing with props and can make it easier in certain cases. However, one note is that context shouldn't just be thrown in there just for any reason. There are 2 main cases where it makes sense. So one case is where multiple components need access to the same data. So I guess this is more in line with what we're going to use context for our particular example, where we logged in with our user, we have a user info. In that case, we have a token and a username. It makes sense that pretty much every page might want access to that. Like, we're not using it on every page, but it's basic information where like the username, if we want to display like, say hello to the user, just display a prompt on the home page, we totally could do that. But we would have to pass down an additional prop to our homepage. So if we want to just kind of outline that, so if I go back to my app.js, so we have all these routes, right? What we've done so far is we updated our login and article page to take in props, right? So in this case, our add article page takes in a user prop, and we can ignore login page. That's a little different case. Yeah, so our add article page takes in a user prop because we actually want to use investigate that token and use that token for submitting our article content. But if we think about like our homepage, so our homepage is right here. If we wanted to say like, when they log in, we would say hello, John, or whatever the username is. We need to pass down another user prop down to the homepage. Now that totally can be done, but notice that we're starting to add like a user prop to pretty much every component. Like we have it in our app nav, we added it to our add article. I'm thinking about adding it to my homepage now. So nothing wrong with the way we're doing it, but it gets kind of tedious. And again, if it's common information, this is where context would make some sense. So that's one case. The second case is, again, it's not that evident within our current application because it's not that large scale. But you can imagine that you could have like maybe like half a dozen or even more like levels of components. Like you might have your parent component, then a child component, and that child component might have several child components, and then those children might have more children. So it could just get really, really nested. And then if you think about passing props from your parent, and let's say only like your great grandchildren, whatever, need access to one piece of data that the parent owns, then it doesn't make sense that you just pass a prop to your intermediate child if they're just not going to use it. If their only job is to pass the prop that they get from their parent down to their child without actually using that data, it gets a little less sensible to just go through that waterfalling of prop to children, and that child passes its prop to its child until you get to like 6 levels down, or wherever the actual component needs to consume that data. So those are the 2 main use cases for it. So we'll see the first use case where we're just going to provide our user info to our entire website, and we use it as needed. And then if we have time, we could try to kind of visualize what the second case would clear up for us. All right, so context, use it in limited cases. Using it too extensively can kind of break your reusability of components. They kind of get dependent on something that's not contained within them. So just be aware. So using a React context, there's 3 main steps. It's actually, the good thing is it's not that difficult to add a context. First thing we need to do is create a context object. Then we need to set up a provider component. This is where the data for the context is coming from. And then finally, any component that wants to, any child component of the provider that wants to use the context can use it as needed. So not every component may use it. They could just ignore it and nothing's going to change for them. All right, so let's focus on this a little bit more. So creating context. This is pretty straightforward. We use this create context method from React. So the syntax of it simply is you call create context. You can pass an optional default value to it. Again, this is optional, as the naming would make it seem. So I could totally leave this off and just do my context equals create context, and I'd be good to go. So this would be likely created in a new file. So I would have a mycontext.js, create my context, and I'm good to go. And I would probably export this context and import it wherever I need to use the context. All right, so that's creating a context. Pretty straightforward. But any questions? Default value, we'll talk more about when this is used. It's not totally clear how this is used, but we will cover it. Okay, next, context provider. So this is where actually we're setting up our source for our context. So the stuff I've highlighted in yellow is what you need to add to get your provider in place. So in this case, I'm going to import my context from wherever my context file was. And then simply to use it, that context, again, we used create context, will provide some child components. One is provider, and the other one is component. So in this case, I'm providing data from my app.js. So that value, whatever I want to pass down, or not pass down, but have available, is through a value prop. So it has to be named value. You can't just name it user and have it work as expected. Value is a predefined prop that is going to be used within this context object. All right, so you'll wrap my context.provider, again, whatever your context is named, .provider, and wrap all of your children components that might want access to this context. All right, so in this case, we have a bunch of routes in our app.js, so that's what we're going to wrap with our context. All right, so this is our provider, and then we have consumers. So consumers are actually what's going to use the data that we created. So this is in some child component.js. Again, we import our context, and simply to use it, the stuff I've highlighted in yellow, we use myContext.consumer because this is consuming data, and then we got to do something as shown here. So basically, we're going to pass some context value, and then we're going to render using that context value. So I put it into a function. So render something, again, will just be our typical render that we always use. So just kind of point that out. Like if we had to render a form, this is what would be in our render something function. But that would take in my context value, and then that could use that context value as needed. All right, so the syntax, again, gets kind of messy. You're going to have a fat arrow function within your render. That's why it probably makes sense to break up your actual rendering into a different function. But you could totally do it all in the render method, and it's up to you if you think that's clean or easy to read. Okay, so let's actually give this a try. Again, there's a few steps, but the good thing is it's not too complicated to set it up. It might be a little more complicated to understand fully what's going on, but hopefully we can talk it through and get it working. All right, so this is where we're going to go back to, again, I know I skipped over some sections, but I just want to get new site working and then refactor it after we have it working. So this is where we're going to go back to our user context creation. So that's kind of halfway through the page on our README. All right, so I'm just going to follow the steps that they have listed. First thing I'm going to do is create a new folder in my source directory called context. Get to organize your files. And then in context, I'm going to create a new file called user context.js. Okay, in here, I'm going to import create context from React. Now I could use that, so let's do const user context equals create context main. That's all we had to do, and then we want to export. So export default user context. Now, as we mentioned, we could provide a default value if we wanted to. So if we want to do that, we do something like const default value equals. All right, so and this user context should match the data that we want to put into it. So let's take a look at that in app.js. So we're basically going to be passing our user info around within our application. So we probably want our default value to kind of mirror that. So let's do that. If you guys remember, my user info looked something like token, and that'll be empty string. And I also have a username property, and that can also be empty string. Actually, let's make that null. All right, so this is my default value. Now again, we'll see where this is actually used. It's not totally obvious when default value is used. In this case, I'll pass in default value here, and that's my user context. All right, so we achieved step one, which is creating a user context object. Again, not too many lines of code, pretty easy to whip up there. Okay, so I saved that, and now let's actually set up our provider. So this is what's going to be giving our information to our child components. So in app.js, let me stop my footer there. All right, let's do import user context from, and I got to find it. So I think it was my dot star context. All right, and user. There we go. So now we have our user context imported. And if you remember, we just need to wrap our child components so that any of these children can have access to the data there. So I'm going to actually put it within my div, and we'll do user context.provider. Again, this is a pre-created component within context. So provider, and then I'm going to have some value that I pass it. And I'm going to wrap all my child routes with that component. Okay, so I got to provide it some value. I have that value available, so that's going to be this.state.user. And this is coming from what we were storing here. And that's going to be tied to this user context. All right, so let's actually clean up some of the code we had before. So again, we're attempting to replace the props that we're passing out. That's the whole point of the context. So I'm actually going to get rid of this from appNav. So appNav will no longer have a prop passed down to it. Likewise, my add article page is no longer going to have this user passed to it either. So we're still going to want this redirect. So I'm going to keep this as a render function. So this is all fine, but again, my base article page will not have a prop passed to it. That's what I removed. Likewise, appNav, no prop. But we still want that access to that info, right? So this is the point of user context. So let's save this and go to appNav first. All right, so we're using this .props.user here, but again, we're not passing props anymore. So we need to actually do a little something different here. So this is going to get a little messy. So I'm actually going to break this out to a function just for my benefit. It's called render app now. All right, and this is actually going to take in a user context. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to copy all this. All of this. All right, so my render function is going to be a little easier to read now. My render appNav will need to return still kind of messy here though. Nav bar. All right, hopefully it's still easy to read. Just want to match up my parentheses. Okay, so that's going to be my function. It's going to take in this user context, which we need to provide to this render appNav. So we're going to have something here. It's going to call render appNav, and that's going to take some user context object. But this needs to be defined. It's not magically just going to know what this value is. This is where we use our consumer. What's the issue here? Expected.
It's because you got extra parentheses on line 11.
Man, you guys save my butt all the time. So right here, yeah, that's why I had to return. Thank you. That would have taken me quite more time to figure out. All right, still not happy. Let's see what I screwed up here. So I have this parentheses, that matches up with that, that looks correct. Let's see, expected. All right, we'll figure this out. User context. Oh, I know. I need to wrap this in a div, I bet. Okay. All right, so seems to be happy now. This should render, but we need to actually pass a user context, as we were talking about context. So this is going to come from our consumer of our context. So let's add that in. So we're going to do user. I think I need to import first. All right. Import user context from the same location from that context. I guess it's a slightly different location. We're in app nav, so it's navigating upwards. So we're in app nav. We gotta go up 1 level, 2 levels, and then go to context. So it's gonna be dot dot slash dot dot context dot user context. All right, so we have our user context. Now I'm gonna add a component user context dot consumer, and that's gonna wrap this bit of code. And so this is actually gonna, this consumer is gonna automatically pass the user context in this case, and we're just going to feed that to our render app nav. So it looks a little funny, but essentially this consumer will provide this context for us. Again, to review, this context is the actual value that we provided in our provider. So go to app.js. It's going to be this.state.user. That is what user context is going to equal. And if we want to just refresh our memories, that's going to be coming from login page. So it's going to look something like this. This is what our context will be. It'll be an object that has a token property and a username property. All right, so let's go back to, where were we? We were in app nav. All right, so user context is passed into render app nav. Now, instead of using this.props.user, because that no longer exists, we want to use user context dot token, I guess. So actually, no, we want to check user context because user context might be null, because that's what we've set it to in app.js. My default value is null, so I do want to check that appropriately. So if user context is something, then we can use it. Let's see, user context and user context dot token is something. Just be safe, and then we'll replace this dot props with user context. Any questions so far? So we replaced our this.props with user context, and that user context is coming from user context.consumer. And user context is a name that we gave to our context. .consumer is a child component that automatically is created when we create the context. Okay, so we updated our app nav. I'm actually gonna do something slightly different with our add article page. So let's go back to my slides. So again, we set up a consumer and we consume the data. There's a different way we could do it for a class-based component. So this is class-based only. We do have an option to set context type on our class. So again, I have some child component here that does some rendering. Again, this is something we've done over and over. The thing you need to add is at the very bottom of your file, outside of your class definition, you want to call your class, so in this case, some child component. There's a .context type property on it, and you want to set that equal to whatever your context is. All right, so this will actually let you use this .context, and that'll be equal to your context value. So again, this is only for class-based components. You have another, I guess, way you could go about it. And let's actually see that. So I'm gonna go back to my code. So I'm in add article page. I'm gonna do it the way, the other way we just talked about. So in this case, I have my add article class. I'm gonna go to the very bottom here, I'm going to do add article dot context type. Notice VS Code knows what I'm talking about. I'm going to set that equal to user context, but I do still need to import user context into this file. So let's, oh, I already did that. Great. I guess I think VS Code did that for me automatically because I don't remember doing that. But yeah, so I did add article.context type and set that equal to the context type value to my user context. So now let's see how we can actually use the context value within our rendering. So this.props.user, again, we no longer have that, but now I can use something like this.context. So that's my context value. I don't think I do use it up here, so I need to update that. I guess this code is not actually going to be used because we have that redirect, but I'll keep it in there. All right, so when we're actually submitting our article, we're using our user to determine or to get our token value. So in this case, to replace this, I'm going to do this context, and let's check this context token. And this dot. All right. So again, we just replace our props with this dot context, and the reason we can do that is because we added this magical line on line 73, where we set the context type for the class. So any instance will have this dot context set to our user context. All right, so let's actually try. We made a couple changes. We maybe should have checked incrementally, but let's just check right now that we didn't break any functionality. And then we'll talk about what we did here, and then talk about functional components briefly also. Okay, any questions? All right, let's test this out. So I'm going to run my Docker. That over here. All right, so this is my homepage. As I expect, I see that I need to log in because I have a login link here. If I try to go to add article, that should redirect me because that's something we set up. So I'm going to click add article. Okay, we're automatically taken to the login page as expected. Let's try to log in. sean@doe.com, open sesame, submit. Okay, we were taken to our homepage. Notice that our we have a logout link now, so we are successfully logged in. So it seems like our app nav is working correctly. Again, right? We made the code changes where we see app nav. We added this user context at consumer. We're passing the user context data to our render method. And that render method is using the user context to determine the username as such. All right, the reason, again, there might be a question here, why am I checking user context and user context.token? That's because theoretically our token can be invalid. Like if it's null, that means we didn't get a valid login. And that can happen because of my default value. So where'd my default value go? Let's see. User context. All right, so I talked about this default value, but we're not actually able to use the default value. This, again, is optional. You don't need to provide this. This is used if your component cannot find a provider for the context. So if we actually want to see this in play, we could, let's just mess around with this a little bit. Let's have a dummy username. So let's just say, I don't know, Barney. And then let's say our token is going to be something. Okay, if we have that as our default value, and I go back to app.chat.js, I'm going to comment out this provider, because this provider is always going to provide a value, even if this .state.user is null, we're still providing a value. So in this case, the context is going to know that, hey, I got a null value or I got an actual value. So again, this is not coming from the default value that we passed here. But let's say we either forgot or for whatever case, like we just don't have a provider. So I'm going to comment this out and comment this out. And that's going to break. No, that should be fine, I think. All right, let's refresh. All right, notice it says logout Barney now. This is the default value. So it thinks we're logged in. We're actually not logged in. But the default value, the way we set it up, is that we provided like a dummy token and a dummy user. So according to our website, we have a valid token and a username. So that's why it's actually showing a logout warning. But if you actually try to add an article, again, that token we just made up, the server's gonna be like, no, that's not a legit token. It's gonna give us an authorization failure or authorization required message. Let's actually try doing that and see what happens. So add article, why were we taking here? Let's take a look at app.js. So we were redirected because we're not actually using our context here. We're using the actual user. So that's actually why we're taken to the login page, even though we had a dummy, I guess, user context that seemed valid. But if we took this out, we'd still be able to get to the add article page. We'd still be able to add an article, but the server will still be like, hey, you need to actually have valid credentials there. Yeah, so that's where the default value comes into play. Again, if your consumer, for whatever reason, can't find a provider up in the chain, again, maybe you left it out, or maybe you're using a component in a different way than it was expected, it will default to whatever you want it to default. So sometimes it makes sense to have a valid default. In this case, having a random token and random username does not make sense. So I'm going to set that back to this. But in this case, I'm not actually using this default value because I will have a valid provider for my child components. So let's add that back in. And I think we wanted to test this, right? So login John, password. Wait, yeah, so our app nav was working correctly. Let's make sure our add article is working correctly. So let's do something. What else? We have seen Little Mermaid, great movie also. John, Little Mermaid was a great movie, but I think all right, that'll be our article submit. All right, seemed to work fine without errors. And yep, I got my Little Mermaid article down here too. Great, so we implemented a user context. We created a user content object. We set up a provider, and we set up consumers for it so that whatever child component wanted to use the user info, it could use it without having props passed down to it. Any questions on either of the methods that we used? I guess there's one note I need to add about add article page. So doing it this way kind of makes it easier because we just use this.context. Again, just to highlight that. We set up context type, therefore we do something simple like this.context. The one caveat there is it is possible to have multiple context objects that you pass down to child components, or not pass down, but offer to child components. In that case, you can't use this method to specify context because this only is, you're limited to one context. You can't have multiple contexts stored in a context type. So if you want to have multiple contexts, then you need to do it I guess the other way where we wrap with consumers. So in this case, if we had like a secondary context, and I'm just gonna kind of wing it here, and maybe we could see an actual example. But if I had my context as another type of context, I could have consumer here. Consumer. All right, so we would wrap this, and this would be, I think I screwed the order up here, but we'll go with it. So in this case, we'll get my context value. And then we'd have to wrap this with what we had before. So user context. And then, yeah, so again, it gets kind of messy because it's going to need some curly braces around it also. Right. Add a curly brace there, curly brace there. Wrap that. My tabs are getting kind of out of line here. Okay, I think that should do it. So I have a typo. All right, so in this case, I have multiple contexts. I have a user context, and that provides user. context value if I want to name that maybe a little better. But then I could also nest another consumer, and I could nest this like 5 different consumers I want and pass all those contexts to my render app nav. Versus if I was just doing context type, I can't achieve the same thing as easily. There are ways around it if you still want to use this.context for all your context values. That kind of require merging your contexts and then providing one central context for your class. But yeah. Any questions? Let me get rid of this code because I kind of made it up. What questions you guys have about contexts? Again, easy to implement, maybe a little more harder to kind of digest mentally to understand what's going on. But you just have a source of data and you have a consumer of data. Hopefully that all makes sense from a high level. Not too far. Okay, I think I might code back to where I had it before. Hope I didn't break my site. All right, looks like that's working. Okay, so there's no questions. Let's talk about the functional base. So functional-based components. So in functional-based components, you got to do something slightly differently. Instead of having access to like this.context, you could use something called useContext. I guess I didn't import that properly here, but useContext would be coming from React also. And simply you call useContext, pass in the context you want to provide, and then you would have access to that value. Again, pretty simple to set up with functional-based components. Instead of using this.context, use this paradigm, and you'll be good to go. You would have access to your context within that functional component. No questions? Okay, so yeah, I think we have maybe enough time to do the example I wanted, but to show it on a high level of the second case, so just to review, there's 2 main cases outlined for when you want to use a context. One is when you want multiple components to have access to the same data. The other case is where maybe you want a far descendant component to have access to some data. And the reason context makes sense is, again, you don't want to pass props from one component to another, multiple levels when the intermediary components are not even caring about that prop, right? It just kind of messes up your code. You have additional values that are just being passed around from one component to another. Not the best design in that case. So this is where I'm going to dive back to, I guess, a previous example. So this is just a base outline of some components that we have. We have our app parent component, some child components that we have, our app nav, which is on every page. We have a home page or a section page that we might go to. And then both home page and section page use a component called article list. All right, so one of the extended challenges I had asked for from New Site 4 was to have the ability to search, or I guess filter articles from your app nav. So I actually don't have that coded up because I'm using the bulk base code that we provide. So in this case, our home page has a search, but our section page, if we go to world, like I can't filter articles here. But it would make sense, like if I could do it on my home page, why can't I filter section articles, right? We'll actually try to code that up. But on a high level, I just want to move the search field into my nav bar, because that nav bar is present on all pages. And then I could be able to use that filter word either on my home page or my section page, will be the ultimate goal. So if I look at this conceptually, I have app nav, and I'm going to move the search bar into there. So app nav will be providing filter word that's going to be the source of filter word. I'm going to provide it to our parent component. If we do it the props way, app will pass filter word down to home page, and it'll also pass filter word as a prop down to section page. And both of these would pass down filter word to article list. Again, I have a particular design in mind, so this might not be what you were thinking about, which is totally fine. Like I assume most of you guys probably had home page and section page using the filter word and then calling the API the filter, which is, again, the way we kind of designed it. But the way I have in mind is actually going to have article list do some filtering for us. So in this case, notice that we have these intermediate components that don't actually need filter word. They're just taking a prop and passing another prop down to its child or their child. So this, again, it's not too bad. We only have like 2 levels that we're going through. But imagine having like 6 or 7 levels of components where all you're doing is passing a prop to another component, which is in turn passing a prop down to its child. That gets kind of pointless. So this is where context comes into play. So when we create a context, the parent just provides a context, and then our article list, which is going to ultimately use filter word, can just use that context. Homepage and section page don't really need to be modified, right? So app is a provider, and then article list is our consumer for our filter context. All right, so this is, again, just a slightly cleaner way to do it. Again, just kind of visualize it. Imagine we had 6 levels, and the bottom level, only like one particular bottom level component needed it. This will make a lot more sense using a context than using the prop design. Okay, so I'm gonna quickly try to code this up. I think we have about 15 minutes. I think that's achievable. Definitely, again, stop me if you don't understand what I'm trying to do. But my ultimate goal is to move the physical search bar into app nav. App nav will provide the word that's typed in by the user to app. And then app is gonna provide a context that only article list is gonna consume. Homepage and section page could use it, but they're not going to in my design. So let's try to get this going. Okay, what do I want here? So first thing, I want to move that search bar. That should be hopefully not too difficult. So let's see, we have this input. Try and grab it, go to app nav, and drop it in there somewhere. I'm not going to worry too much about styling, so apologies if it looks kind of gross, but all right, let's wrap this in the div, because again, we gotta return only one component, like have as many nested components as needed. All right, so I moved this input into this div. My tabbing is kind of messy, apologies about that. Try to maybe make that a little cleaner. Okay, whatever. Hopefully that's, you can read that well enough. Basically, I just have an input that's gonna be underneath my nav bar. So that's part of my app nav component. And maybe add a label here. Label for I'm not sure if this is name or ID. I actually think ID might be the value. And then this label will just have filter articles. Okay, cool. Let's see that. Homepage, also I had this handle search, which I'm going to take out of here. The homepage is not going to be the one doing it. Nav. All right, this will have a handle search that we will call when they are typing. All right, that looks, hopefully works without typos here. Label, label. Let's take a look at this and see where we are. Fetch article is not find. Yeah, that's fine. So in this case, I'm going to my app. I'm going to add a filter word as a state. So filter word, and this will default to empty string. And then I'm going to do a handle filter. This will be past a filter word. All right, so new filter word will be our updated value. So we'll do this set state. Again, I know I'm going quick. Hopefully you guys are familiar with all the items doing, but please stop me if anything I add is confusing. But I have filter word. I'm going to set that equal to new filter word. All right, so this can be a method I pass down to my app nav, because my app nav is actually going to generate my filter word for me. So let's actually do that with a prop. So we'll do handle filter. Okay, so handle filter I've created. I'm going to use that here. So instead of doing my actual fetching, because the homepage was using the filter word and using that to fetch, I'm going to do stuff a little differently. So this doesn't actually need to be async. Handle search, we'll actually just call this props handle filter. I know my naming is a bit wonky. This will be event target value, I think. Okay, so I think that's what we want. All right, so as the user is typing, we're going to constantly update our filter word. And then that's going to be passed to our parent. So app, the app will hold a filter word. And that's where I want to create a context. So let's create a context quickly. I'm going to copy my user context. It's going to look very similar. Add a new file, call it filter context.js. And then paste that in here. Filter. I'm not going to bother with the default value. That's usually not too much of a concern. So again, very, very simple looking item here. Create context, creates a context, and you return. I guess one thing I mentioned that maybe you guys had a question about or didn't, there might be a question, why not just have a global value that any of my components can kind of consume, like not consume, but just access when they want. So like, why not just have, if we go to my app page, like some global value here that's user, and then I can update this user value from my login page and then have anyone that wants to use this user value. Why not have that assigned? The reason is when your context actually updates, that will trigger a re-render versus if you just update some global value, it's not gonna, like your child components are not gonna know, okay, the value I was referencing has changed, so I need to re-render, right? This is the same principle of use state or set state and also props. Like whenever props change or states change, React automatically knows that it needs to try to re-render and see if anything updates, right? So if you do it with just a straight up value without actually tying it to React, well, React is not gonna be smart enough to know, okay, you're using a global value and the global value changed, let me re-render. Like React is not that talented. So that's why you can't just have global variables and access them and expect React to work. So that's where context automatically triggers a re-render if the source value has changed. All right, so filter context, have that set up. Let's go to my app and import that. So I have import filter context from wherever that was. Okay, so filter context exists. I need to use it. So this is where we're actually going to use multiple contexts. So to see kind of how that is laid out, I'm going to nest one within the other. The ordering doesn't really matter for your providers. All right, we have some nesting, one provider within another. Again, you could do it the other way. You could have user context on the outside. It for the most part, doesn't matter. Unless, for example, if user context relied on filter context for its value, then the nesting order would matter. But in this case, these are independent context objects. So the way you do it is up to you. State.filter word. All right, so I have another context. We'll provide filter word as the information. Filter word, update, I think that looks correct to me. All right, so let's actually go down to homepage. Homepage is not actually using that filter, that's fine. Let's go to article, what was it? Article list, I believe. Yeah, so article list is actually gonna do my filtering for me. So I think another, I don't know if I wrote it on the page, but another challenge was to cut down on API calls. So this is where we're actually not gonna use the functionality from an API. And the reason being is because we can mimic it or we can do it ourselves and this would be more efficient. So the way filtering is working right now is we pass a filter value to our API. The API is actually using that filter value and just checking the titles and filtering based on title. I don't think it's actually filtering based on the body, but if it were, we could do that also. But again, we could totally do this on the client side, and it makes more sense to do it on the client side because again, you don't want to be making an API call each time the user enters a character as they're searching. That's going to be really inefficient, especially if our content or amount of content is exponentially increased, right? Right now we have only like 40 articles, so it's pretty quick. It seems seamless that we make these API calls, we get the data back, and it like as the user types, it's actively filtering. But I promise you, if we had like 40 million articles that we're serving up, you're going to see a huge delay, and it's going to get cumbersome to make all those API calls. All right, so actually in my article list, I'm going to take advantage of that context I created. So this would be imports filter context. Gotta find it, so I think it's 2 levels up. Yep, context and filter context. And let's use it here. So currently, article list is simply taking in an article's prop and then just rendering all those articles. But we want to do something a little more conditional. So in this case, so map, I'm going to change this to filter. No, let's make this map. All right, so map's going to generate this, but I want to not do that for all items. All right, let me just use map for now. List item group. That looks good. Okay, so let's do some investigation here. So we have article, and that has a title. And let's actually just search that title for, let's see. We need our user context here, or sorry, our filter context. So let's set that up, filter context.consumer. And that's gonna pass filter context value. And let's make a function, so render article list. Any questions? Hopefully I haven't lost you guys with my idea here. So I'm going to have a new function. It's going to be render article list that takes in filter. Let me returning before list group. All right, so this will take in filter context value, and then if filter context value, let's do let show article. If Boolean, that's going to be true by default. Then let's see, if we have our filter context, then we want to search our title and search for filter context value. All right, a few more minutes here. I think we should be able to achieve this. But as always, with live coding, definitely can run some issues. So what's going on here? All right, so this is not a single return. I need some curly braces here. Again, just to reiterate what issue I was having, since I'm using an anonymous function, previously we only had one line that we're returning, so we didn't have to have a return statement nor curly braces, but now I'm adding more lines into my anonymous function, so you need to use curly braces in that case. Return. Okay, so I think I'm good now. I have short article index, so show article should be set to true if index is greater than 0. So I think if you do a search and you don't find the item, index should be -1. We should double check docs for that. But in that case, show article should be set to true. If we have a filter context value. If our filter context is empty, then this should work, but let's just say, I guess if it's empty, this should return. If it's empty, it's a falsy value, so this won't execute. And then in that case, we'll do a ternary here. So we're going to do show article. All right, show article. If that's true, we want to show this list group. Else, I have some errors here. We're just gonna let's just show nothing. All right, what's the issue here?
You gotta close out the curly braces.
Gotcha. List group. All right, not sure what the issue is here. I think I need to wrap that. Okay, we'll figure that out, hopefully. But yeah, we're returning conditionally, show article. Yeah, I might have mismatched parentheses somewhere. So this is getting closed out here. This is closing out that. I think that's all kosher. Something about this. So if I move this ternary, okay, so this was fine. All right, let's just do it a way that I can do it. So if show article, we're going to return this. Sorry, I don't know what was going on with that ternary. Always can get kind of complicated with JSX. All right, if show article, return that. Else we'll return. So I don't need that. I just been extra parentheses that I had. Okay, so if that, return that. Else I was going to return empty string. Okay, so that should hopefully work. Let me search my documentation on search quickly. So I get rusty on that. So let's do JavaScript string search. Okay, the search method takes in a regex expression. So all right, does it have to be regex? I'm not sure. Let's just try this. If it doesn't work, I'll bother the regex. But I'm going to search, then I should get a value back. The index of the first match, -1 if no match. All right, that seems cool. The only thing I need to check is the search actually search from the start. Does anyone remember? Oh well, let's give this a try. Probably will run some errors. Article is not defined on article list. Line 12. So that's this dot props articles. Input group not defined. Sorry, I brought that from the home page. Let me grab all that. List. All right. We have this 5 more minutes. If I don't have this working, we'll definitely abandon it, but definitely possible input group not defined. Why is that not liking it?
It said it was missing from AppNav.
What was that?
It says it's missing from AppNav.
You're in article list, not in AppNav. You need to input that in AppNav.
Gotcha. Thank you. You guys are lifesavers. Okay, render article is not defined. That's probably because I forgot this. What was that? Yep, this here. Okay, hopefully that takes care of all the errors. All right, there we go. So this filter articles is in my app nav. Now, it's not on my homepage. It's a little misaligned, but hopefully that's okay. Let's try searching for something. All right, got an error. Handle filter is not a function. Handler, I think that's a typo. So where's that? Where's that? That was in app nav. Handle filter, right? Because that was the prop I was passing down, which was called handle filter. Was I passing it down? Oh, sorry, right here. Handle filter. Sorry, that was a typo. Apologies there. Let's try that again. All right, notice it's working. I guess my Lion King article went away because I restarted, but seems to be sort of working. So it's case sensitive, so I might want to make that case insensitive, but notice if I search for nostrum, it filters that article. There's another article with lowercase nostrum. So that's working on my home page. Let's try it for our section page. Let's go to national. There's a few articles here. Let's search or bring this down to whoa. All right, seems to be working. Again, this is our context. We're only using our context in our app list. We're not using it in our homepage. We're not using it in our section page. Again, this cuts down our API calls because we're no longer calling an API each time we filter. We get our total list of articles, and then we manually filter it on our client side. And that's just going to make it more efficient because this is much faster than making a bunch of API calls, right? We're just calling search on each title and determining if we should actually show the article or not. So we actually still have the full article data, which makes it easier. So if we remove our filter, we don't have to reload. We don't have to make another API call to, I guess, clear the filter. We already have the data. We're just rendering on the articles based on that conditional. All right, so just kind of wrap that up. Again, we just achieved this where we provide a filter word from AppNav, we create a filter context, and we kind of subvert our intermediate components because they don't really care about filter word with our new design. Article list is the only one that cares about it, so it can directly just consume the data without worrying about props being passed down to it. Okay, that was using React context. So hopefully you guys kind of understand the purpose of context. Again, it might be a little tricky to go through all the steps for it. Again, the 3 steps, just review them. We need to create a context object, which is pretty straightforward. You just use create context from React. Then you need to set up a provider. So this might require some practice, but to look at that, we provide a value. It has to be a value property that you specify, and that would be what you're passing down to your children, or not passing down, but having available to all your child components that you wrap with your provider. And then whichever child component, if they want to consume it, you import your context and use the myContextConsumer component and simply use the data that's automatically provided by the consumer. Okay, so hopefully you guys get some practice with that. Again, context can definitely be useful, especially in the second case I outlined where you don't want to pass down props. But again, the other case would be if your app just needs to provide general information that most of your components might want to use, instead of just having props, again, being passed down, you might just create a context and have whoever wants to use the common information as needed. Okay, that takes care of context. Any questions regarding context or new site 6? I want to make sure you guys can wrap up this project and feel good about it. Again, hopefully your new website looks much better than our default one that we provided. But yeah, kind of have fun with React Strap and CSS and added functionality as you see fit. Again, we've told you the requirements, but there's probably more that you can add that seems sensible for any like news website. Kind of use your imagination and add functionality and kind of get more familiar with React that way. What questions do you have before we break for lunch? Any questions? Seems to be working. Looks like I have 2 articles. All right, cool. If there's no other questions, then I want to bid you guys a good lunch and good luck with new site